Good evening, everyone I can't see out there. I'm happy to be here. Thank you to the festival for having me here to Chicago to read and talk. For all writers like to talk about themselves. Else, why would we write books? So I thought I would read, my new book's called Mermaids in Paradise. And it's a bit more towards satirical than some other recent books of mine. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's about a couple from Southern California that goes on a honeymoon in the Caribbean and meets a very earnest marine biologist who claims to have discovered mermaids in a coral reef. And chaos ensues. And I'll just read you the very first pages. I'll just read for about 5 minutes or so, just to give you a sense of what this book is. Mermaids in Paradise, Chapter 1 is called Newlyweds. Chip picked out the destination for our honeymoon. He'd always wanted to take a cruise, just like Middle Americans. Middle Americans love cruises, Chip said ardently. Chip's a romantic when it comes to the people of the Midwest, and also those dwelling along the Rocky Mountain front, the landlocked parts of the South, things like the Dakota area or what have you. Those places are somewhat mythic to Chip. He has what I suspect is a fanciful idea. People that live away from New York or LA, DC or San Francisco, maybe in a pinch Boston or even Seattle, those people are modern-day pioneers. The Middle Americans are resolute, Chip thinks, living by choice in that vast, featureless space, that oddly irrelevant no man's land. They have their reasons, Chip believes, reasons we couldn't understand, or moral fiber, possibly. To hear Chip talk, you'd think every Nebraskan male knows how to put a horseshoe on a mule. They know how to bring forth grain from dirt, or what a combine harvester is. They get what happens to that brought forth grain, the steps before the Cheerios. The women knit long underwear and are adept at fruit canning. The best Middle Americans are like this anyway, pretty much old-fashioned, according to Chip. Their kids make charming toys from wooden boards, often with poking out nails in them. Not only that, those children are delighted with the products of their ingenuity. They go ahead and play with them. Those children wave a splintered board and think of marvelous fairyland. But Chip doesn't want to travel there in person to Middle America. That wasn't one of the honeymoon options. Chip's a romantic, not a moron. You don't have a Brentwood zip code and choose to spend your wedding vacation in Dayton. Literally no one does. From what I've seen, few people travel toward the middle of the country for personal reasons, unless a parent is dying. The two of us won't have to do that since my parents, may they rest in peace, are interred in the Bay Area. Chip's father was a deadbeat dad who left when he was 10. And Chip's mother, more's the pity, has a condo near here. Chip just wanted to meet some of the hardy pioneers. He didn't want to physically go to the puzzlingly dull places where they live. He feared the religious hysterics, in addition, who inhabit the boring wastes and can be alarming. They frighten a person when gathered in groups or hordes or individually. Chip talks about that quite a bit when not gaming. The fact that honest Middle America, once plodding along reliably with combines for the menfolk, homemade preserves for the women, and for the children some highly entertaining planks of wood, is now threatened by a growing subculture. A subculture so large it's bigger than the rest of us, actually, which maybe means it's not a subculture at all, says Chip, with a worried aspect. That's where the fear comes in. The non-subculture is made of people who believe that fossils are a trick. These people are suspicious of biology and mortally offended by an ape. Also, they're angry about it. On the one hand, moral fiber, possibly, but on the other hand, madness. In any case, I said no to the cruise idea. I couldn't think of a worse prospect, a floating plastic city full of food-eating vacationers with potential for massive water shutdown, decks to be littered with plump orange bags of human waste, clothes spaces, planned activities, nausea, the smell of greasy carbs, families wearing bright primary colors or even vibrant fluorescents, heaving themselves into a pool. Among those families wearing flashy day-glow clothes, those clothes that actually assaulted your eyeballs with their hideous fluorescence, there'd have to be some victims of the morbid obesity pandemic, And with the possibilities of food poisoning, sewage overflow, and tragic obesity, a cruise was something I couldn't face. And so I went to Chip. I sat down beside him and took his hands and said, "Chip, I'm glad to be marrying you, but no cruise ships, not a single one." So Chip moved on to other honeymoon concepts. He found a French driving tour involving Maseratis and Formula One race cars, where pros would drive a newlywed couple many times around a racetrack, super fast. So fast their heads would have to be spinning, their innards turbulent. Not so auspicious, Chip, said I, for honeymooners, in my humble opinion. He ferreted out a Peaks of the Himalayas voyage next, with visits to monasteries, meditations, and nosebleeds from the lack of oxygen up there. I always think I would have been a monk, a nun, or some other holy person in another life. It turned out I was modern, well-dressed, and fairly talkative, but that's a quirk of timing. If I'd been born in the medieval part of history, I hope I would have been a monk or nun, quiet, and wearing a certain mantle of wisdom. I hope I would have used the time to think, possibly more than I do now, as a medieval-type person. I see myself singing in chapels, light streaming down on me, the singing of hymns, the kneeling down to pray, the walking with a proud, erect posture. I wouldn't have been a peasant, I hope, busily sweeping mud off pigs, possibly dying while grunting as a baby's head stuck out of me. However, currently I'm not a nun/monk, and neither is Chip, and chances are will never be. I thought maybe the monks would turn out depressing with their enlightened, humble existence. What came up for me considering those Himalayan monks and the gonging sound of temple gongs, the gong, gong, gong. What I thought of was the suspicion a person might start to have in the monkish setting, that marriage overall might start to seem like a bad idea. The inner peace a monk projects, combined with never having sex. I don't know if that attitude is really honeymoon material. You do hear about people, sure, who visit someplace Asian and scenic at a certain altitude, Asian or Indian, and then decide to go native. In one fell swoop, they copy the whole Buddhist or yoga idea. They give away their worldly goods, move to a mountain hut where baths are taken in the snow, and then pretend they never heard of home equity lines of credit or eyelash extensions. Next comes the cross-legged chanting, the wearing of loose and flowing robes, the eating of plain brown rice. Some of them eat the rice just one grain at a time, holding that single grain in long, delicate chopsticks. You hear about it. And despite your incredulity that a person would ever give up the bounty of our modern life, a minuscule part of you can almost see the seduction. Just minuscule, but still, I didn't want to run the risk. I'll take a pass on that serenity, I said to Chip. I'm just not in the mood for it. I think, to be honest, Chip really wasn't in the mood either. Once he did more research and got an inkling that the monks wouldn't be like monks in video games. I think he'd been half hoping for monks with supernatural powers, at least flying kung fu. He first expected temples you could run through, surmounting obstacles and solving puzzles as you went. Then it began to seem as though extremely wise monks might be the best he could hope for, and I think at that point his interest waned. Next, he got pretty enthusiastic on the topic of a shark feeding situation, a shark and stingray feeding package with round-trip fare included optimistically. You put on rubber fins and swim around with hostile marine life. Next came a thrill seeker's week-long air safari, where you jumped from high places such as airplanes and treetops, wearing harnesses clipped to parachutes or bungee cords, plummeting, plunging, then bouncing, screaming, then laughing in relief at not yet being dead. No, Chip, honey, I said. Some other time, though, we'll do that. My point was, I don't need to be reminded I'm alive. I'm well aware of it. Catch me later, when I'm 50. By then, I may be on the fence. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Are you looking for your microphone?
I am.
I think it must be tucked into your chair.
It's right here. Yes.
So, climate change probably looms as the single greatest threat to a livable and diverse planet. And yet the number of US writers who use their fiction to talk about, to frame, and reflect on our misuse of the world is pretty small. And I think the team gets even tinier if you start looking for writers who do this with beautiful, muscular sentences and also a sense of humor. So first off, I just want to say kudos to you, and say it's truly an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk to you this afternoon. Mermaids in Paradise, the book that you just read from us, is particularly exciting, I think, because of its decision to take us comically and obliquely into the question of biodiversity. And I love a book that runs along the rails of a certain genre and then jumps track. And I've been describing Mermaids in Paradise to friends as domestic realism takes a sea dive, a deep sea dive. Because I think, as your reading showed, that its narrator, Deb, doesn't go out looking for mermaids to rescue. She and Chip are on their honeymoon, where the plan is just to eat and drink and have sex and snorkel, and then something happens. So could you begin by just talking a little bit about why you made Deb who she is, and why she makes contact with the mermaid population on her honeymoon specifically? I don't think it's an accident that it happens at that point in her social life.
Sure, let's see. Well, first, who she is. She's sort of a skeptical, upper middle class, white, sort of every woman who's sort of just quintessentially LA, as many of my characters are, though I don't live there. I live in middle America. But no, I live in Arizona. So what I wanted to do with her and Chip sort of, a gamer, but also a guy who does extreme sports and runs this mud marathon that's sort of patterned after the Tough Mudder. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Tough Mudder, but it's this sort of hardcore, long obstacle course where you can get pretty severely injured, or in one case recently, I think, die. It's just extreme macho and stuff. So Chip is a super friendly gamer, and he's also a mud marathoner. And so I wanted to take these two kind of, and he's also just the friendliest man in the world. He just loves everyone. He has this sort of scattershot approach to sociability where everyone he meets, he wants to know, and especially if they're from Middle America. So I wanted to take them and put them in this sort of ritualized context that we associate with honeymoons, and then bring in mermaids, because I've always loved mermaids. But really they're mythical, but they're sort of, rather than being supernatural beings, they're kind of subnatural, right? Because our notion of the supernatural being often involves powers, creatures that have more powers than we do. But poor old mermaids have, really fewer powers than we do, because, they can breathe underwater, I guess. They can swim underwater for long distances, but, so can Michael Phelps. It's not really it's not a real superpower. And then if they want to actually be able to walk on land, they have to give up their voice, or in some cases their lives. So they're really these sort of, and their legs are kind of tied together, right, into tails. And it's doubtful they can even really sit comfortably on those rocks with the features they have, And yet they're obviously sex symbols and beautiful, and we think of their breasts, honestly. When you think of a mermaid, you either think of clamshells or breasts, depending whether it's PG, PG-13. And they have the long hair that they're always brushing, and so there are the sort of strange erotic symbols, but who are, I don't know what the correct term is, but they're handicapped because their legs they can't walk without, making a deal with the sea witch or whatever. So they're just curiously incapacitated beings, and yet they're sexual objects. And so I wanted to sort of bring a creature like that into a tropical honeymoon devoted to, it's a ritual where you're supposed to have sex all the time, and it's supposed to be a sexual journey, right, the honeymoon. So I thought it'd be fun to play the mermaids into that.
Right. No, I think it's brilliant, but I think part of it is that you get them right. I think they've already had sex, and you kind of, this isn't going to ruin anything, but you kind of skate over the sex a little bit, and then they're on the beach.
What are you saying I'm evading writing sex scenes?
No,
Never.
No, I'm saying, I like how you underplay the sex scene, and then you have them sort of vaguely cuddling on the beach, and there's this feeling that Deb gets that she is so bored, that she's happy, but she feels like nothing exciting is ever going to happen to her again. And right at that moment where, it's the pinnacle of heterosexual love. They've married, they've had good sex, they're on the beach. She's just on the cusp of boredom and feeling like life is over. And that's when the contact with the mermaid species comes in. So it feels like you're like ringing the death.
It's a moment where Nancy, the marine biologist, is spotted on a boat coming in and then runs toward them down the beach in full wetsuit. And it's really hard to run just in a full wetsuit. So
It takes a while.
yeah, it takes her a long time to get to them in this sort of slow motion running.
Yeah. So that's the adventure coming at them. So I too love mermaids, and I've long been a fan of your work, but when I heard about this book, just the title and the premise, I was extra excited, and I think it's that long fascination with mermaids, these strange hybrid creatures. And I know there's so much mermaid lore, right? There's like all the folklore from all different cultures, and there's Hans Christian Andersen, and there's Kafka, and there's Disney, and there's like those recent mermaid hoaxes on Animal Planet, which might be fun to talk about. How much did you decide to work with when you looked at the vast hall of mermaid storytelling? What did you decide, oh yeah, I like this, and what did you decide, oh, I'm just gonna throw that back and not even deal with it?
Well, I think I just allude to them fairly glancingly as symbols, right? I sort of don't go, there's no conversations, spoiler alert, there's no actual conversations with the mermaids in here or anything like that. So I don't know, I mean, I was first thinking of like Little Bear, you know, that Little Bear story where Maurice Sendak, where he says he spots a mermaid in the river, but you never really see the mermaid, right, with Little Bear? I don't think you do. It's his father's sort of skeptical father bear of the mermaid. So my mermaids are quite glancing, although we do actually get to see them, and they're sort of the opposite. I guess I do mention the Disney Little Mermaid, although I'm personally more interested in the Hans Christian Andersen mermaids. But there was a glancing reference to the Disney mermaid. But more, the mermaids are, insofar as they're portrayed at all graphically, I think there's a description of one with bad teeth or something, and that they aren't archetypally beautiful, and that
right, the nose is a little, I can't remember if you describe it as being broader, but there's a sense that the face is a singular face.
And Chip says he thinks they have bad teeth because there's no underwater dentistry.
Yeah, right.
Which would be a problem, I mean.
But one of the things I think so wonderful is that in so many of the mermaid stories that are in my head, the mermaids are either friend or foe. They're interested in the people. They're either the women, the female ones are hauling themselves out on the rocks and singing their songs and combing their hair. And the idea is that they're either going to lure the sailors in, and they're either going to have sex with them or they're going to drown them and then eat them. But it's always about what the Mermaid Project is in relationship to the humans. And what I love is that your mermaids are doing a labor of their own, is the phrase, when they're first spotted. They're doing their own thing. And it's hard not to hear the Virginia Woolfian rhythm there, a labor of their own. So I wondered if, did you ever take any wrong turns when you were writing the book where you started to feel like, oh, I am writing more conventional mermaid scenes where it's all about the humans and what they're going to get from them? Or did you always know, you know what, I'm going to not make this a human-centered story? Yeah,
I think the mermaids were always going to be a mysterious species that we never encounter fully. I'm very interested in the balance between knowing and not knowing other creatures, and interested in how important the mystery of other creatures' subjectivity is to us. I think it's vital that the world be full of creatures we don't fully understand. Vital to us as creatures ourselves, that we not know everything there is to know about the world, and that we keep it that way to some degree. And so the mermaids are always fairly distant, except for being described as sort of non-archetypal, as sort of real physical beings. Other than that, they are sort of just kept at symbolic arm's length.
Mm-hmm. Right, which makes me think about animal subjectivity in literature in general. You're somebody who's been writing about animals for years, and I think humans, for obvious reasons, usually put human consciousness at the center of fiction. As soon as I say that, I start thinking of exceptions like Barbara Gowdy did the elephant point of view in The White Bone, or Tolstoy and Anna Karenina goes briefly into the point of view of the dog Laska. Rudyard Kipling wrote these really cringeworthy stories about dogs from their point of view. There's one that begins, "Please, may I come in? My name is Boots." But there are people who try to write from the animal's point of view, but what do you see as the pitfalls, the pleasures, the perils of trying to do that, where you're actually saying not what the goat smells like from a human point of view, but what it feels like to be a goat?
Yeah, I just feel there's so much information I don't have about what it feels like to be a dog or cat because of the language barrier that we have. I do actually think there's so much courage in that Barbara Gowdy book, actually. It's very brave. But I have never felt qualified to write from the point of view of an animal as such. Although I also am, this idea of anthropomorphizing as just sort of the act of speciously putting human emotions onto animals, I sort of reject as well, because I think it's very silly to think that, we're the only ones who have individuality and subjectivity. We know this is not the case. We've learned a lot about other animals' subjectivity and how complicated their inner lives are, but still we don't know very much. I think just for me, language, the texture of language is so much. It's just so informed by human personality that I couldn't make the leap into writing in some supposed animal vernacular. I couldn't do a stream of consciousness of a fish or anything. But I admire those who try. I actually think it's an incredibly, it's a minefield.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanted to talk with you more about animals, and I was thinking about your 2009 book, How the Dead Dream, which is one of my favorites. And you have that real estate developer who starts sneaking into the zoos. And he's looking at, for those of you who haven't read it yet, he's looking at species who are on their way out, so rhinos and wolves, elephants. And so many zoos today have education departments, conservation initiatives, and I know the aesthetic has changed from those concrete cells that are easy to wash down to habitats that are supposed to look realistic. And the zoos keep saying we're protecting animals from extinction, even though they tend to favor exotic animals or cuddly animals that are drawing in the crowds. And I guess you can tell by the way I'm already framing this question that I have some discomfort with zoos, but I would love to hear you talk about what you think and feel about zoos, and even if you could bring in your day job since you work.
Sure. I have a love-hate relationship with zoos. It's hard for me to give up on them, really hard for me to give up on them. Actually, I love this. There's a book by David Hancock, who's sort of an international, somewhat of an expert on zoos. It's called A Different Nature, nonfiction, and it's really great about the pitfalls of zoos and the sort of tragedy of zoos and what might they still have to offer us. Yeah, it's strange. Some are involved in conservation, of course, and captive breeding programs, but it's sometimes a little hard to make. To argue that you have to have animals in small cages for people to look at in order to do captive breeding and conservation, and it's a complex, it's a complex debate. There's a sort of zoo right near my house that I love, but even it has its own problems. It's called the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum, and they have a lot of local, native species, and it's quite a beautiful place, but you always do sort of, you always feel strange, or I do, walking past an enclosure especially, with a large carnivore in there. It's always troubling. One of the worst days of my life actually was at the Barcelona Zoo, where I had made this sort of pilgrimage to see Snowflake, the albino gorilla, who since has died. But as my friend and I passed the orangutan exhibit, there it was a open air exhibit, so there wasn't a fence between the customers or the patrons and the animals, and they were hurling cigarette butts and other pieces of litter at the orangutans, and it was just one of the worst ways I've ever felt. And there's a scene sort of like that in How the Dead Dream, although it's not orangutans in that book. So I actually work in a different part of animal conservation. I work for a nonprofit called the Center for Biological Diversity, where I've been for a long time now. That's my day job. And we do just a lot of litigation over endangered species and climate change. We have a lot of lawyers and a lot of scientists, and we do do a lot of work to get animals and plants protected under the Endangered Species Act. And I think we've protected a little over 500 species now under the Act. So we use existing law to get protection for endangered species.
And does everybody who you work with have a love-hate relationship with zoos? Is that fair to say? Or
We actually don't have, there's no position that we have on zoos because it's so, we just work for animals in the wild, really, for the most part. Although sometimes there are captive breeding programs that intersect with the work we do, but we don't really have much of we don't really intersect that way. And actually, I'm not sure what different individuals' positions on zoos are within. It's just so not what we do on an everyday basis that, I'm not sure.
There's no zoo talk. Okay. All right. Well, before we all get too melancholy, let's go back to the mermaids. One of the things that I feel like no reviewers have commented on yet about Mermaids in Paradise is that there are images in the book. There are images, and I guess there's one person on Shelf Awareness said something about, I got it here, describes the images as typical vacation-like Instagram snapshots of the novel's turning points. But that's it, that's the only thing. So I really wanted to ask you, I found the images sort of mysterious, and I didn't think they functioned the way that critics suggested. What's the story with the images, and how did they play into your thinking about how you were going to represent mermaids?
Well, I wish it were a better answer, but the truth is that I wrote this book along with another book that's sort of paired with it, a companion novel called The Palms of Bora Bora. And I really wanted, which is also about like a tropical vacation, although it's in the other ocean. And it's also about a couple, and they're just sort of these twinned novels. And for that one, I really wanted it to be illustrated by this wonderful illustrator, Sharon McGill, who did this too, but in a very different style. I wanted it to be illustrated the way the Tintin books were, like by Hergé, because I really loved those growing up, and I find them sort of cartoonish. Well, they are cartoons, of course, they are comic strips, as it were, but just sort of really iconic. And that book centers around a porthole, like what you see looking through a porthole, and just the idea of framing a vision in a porthole, because I've always been just obsessed with portholes. And so after she illustrated beautifully that book, I was doing this book, and it couldn't be without illustrations, but the Tintin look wasn't right for this book, and so we just decided to do sort of like iPhone sort of photorealistic snapshots for a few of the scenes, just to sort of play off the text and have fun. But yeah, no one's really mentioned them yet. It's true.
Yeah, which is curious. I mean, I think you're also playing with the reader's appetite to see the mermaids, to get in close. And you always have that finger on every shot. There's a woman's fingernail that's creeping up there to
so
remind you.
So you can't forget. You're not supposed to forget that she's holding the phone.
Yeah, so it's not like reading a children's book where you fall into the illustrations and you lose yourself in the world. Yeah, it's all mediated. So there's this terrible but funny moment in Mermaids of Paradise when people have started to find out about the mermaids, that they exist, and they're on the blogs, they're talking about them. And Deb starts reading the feedback, and she says, "It seemed to me that the virtual world was even worse than the real one when it came to humanity. We were a roiling mass of opinion, and what were those opinions? Small-minded and vicious. That was what had been distilled of our civilization. Here we sat at the technological peak, and what we chose to do at that shining pinnacle was hate each other's guts." And then she goes on to say to her friend, "Where are all the nice people? Seriously." So I wondered, how's the internet working for you these days? As a writer, as a person, as an employee, as a parent, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's a curious realm. I don't go straight into the danger zones like on the internet very often. So because you just see, even if you just like go to an op-ed page of a newspaper and then you see all the strange, just rudimentary expressions of hatred on there and anger, and I find it so puzzling that's where people want to go, that's what they choose to express publicly about themselves and their lives. It's a mystery to me, honestly. I mean, I know there's a lot of anger in the culture, but I'm confused by why it's so satisfying for people to vent in these venues. it's a disturbing phenomenon, I think, just the volume of it. Because, fine, there have always been angry people, but to look at some of those comment pages, I mean, you just think we all were not very bright, and just a sad nation of of stunted sort of and immature souls, and so I don't know. I think it's maybe it'll change. Maybe this is just the first flush of something, and we'll somehow work it out of our system. I hope. I don't know.
Have you been goaded by your publishers to be more of an internet presence? I know that a lot of writers feel like they have to be on Twitter.
I do feel like a lot of younger writers are much more aggressive about promoting themselves, and but it's natural for many of them. It just sort of comes naturally. This is who I am. I am this vision of myself on these pages. I am myself as I present on social media. But for my generation, I think I'm just old enough that it feels like an awkward gesture to me. And I did go on Facebook, and I'm on Facebook, but I don't really understand it. Like I don't, because I went on there partly because my brother and sister wanted to see pictures of my babies, and then partly because my publisher told me that that's what writers, novelists are supposed to do. And so there's this strange hybrid of inappropriate, things on there, and I don't really know how to curate myself. But I know so many writers who are about 10 years younger, so they're like in their early 30s, mid-30s, and they, and it's just natural for them they even know how to go and edit their own page, unlike me, like their own website and stuff. I'm just dating myself terribly. But they go and mess with it on a daily basis, and they just have this really finely curated self-image in that electronic world, and that's not where I am.
Yeah, well, I think if people who are emerging as writers now feel like if they're not on the internet, they're nowhere. Like that's where you're going to find your readers. But I love that you're not feeling pressure to tweet and put out little Lydia Millet nuggets. I mean, part of it that always seems strange to me is the idea that you're supposed to be furnishing all this content all the time, whereas to write a novel, you sort of have to withdraw and just be alone in a room. And so I don't understand when people are tweeting 6 times a day when they're getting their novels written.
It does seem like it's making being a writer or whatever into a different job than it used to be. It's so much is about promotion now and self-promotion for so many writers. I don't know. I think it probably will skew the kind of folks we have who are successful as writers going forward, and maybe not in the best way.
So we talked about anger, and I was thinking you have another book that came out this year. Pills and Starships, which is a wonderful dystopic novel would we say for young adult readers?
Young adult, they say, YA, right?
Yeah, but I loved it, and I'm a middle-aged adult. And there's a moment where this girl who's narrating the story, her name is Nat, and she's 16, and the world has just gone to hell because of climate change. I can't even begin to address the plot, so maybe you'll fill it in as needed.
Terrible talking about plot, but...
Well, anyway, all you have to know is things are terrible, and her parents have decided to die, so they go to this sort of Hawaiian resort, what's left of Hawaii, to have their deaths arranged, curated. And Nat says, don't get me wrong, it's not that I think things are golden, it's just that if there's an angry gene, I don't think I inherited it. And ever since I read that line, I was thinking, does Lydia Millet have the anger gene?
I think I only have the resentment gene.
How does that work? Since your work has a very strong social agenda, but you're not one of these people who's on Facebook writing angry little things about the world, and yet your day job brings you into contact with so much information, right, about species and extinction. How do you remain an optimist, and how do you make sense of the data that you have coming at you as just a regular person coping and as a novelist?
Well, I think there's so much evidence out there now, probably more than ever for us, about the state of the world that it is depressing and it can induce despair. But I kind of feel that you just have to take things, I guess it sounds quite a little 12-steppy or something, but that you sort of have to take things, not necessarily a day at a time, because you do need to have the long view, I think. but the only way not to be full of despair is to just think sort of pragmatically and think about what you can do in your life, and try to be cheerful, and just think about what it is that you can do and what your superpowers are, and proceed as though you're doing the best you can. I mean, I think that's sort of the way, And activists, are often accused of being overly doom and gloom in the conservation movement. And because we know that when people don't feel hope, when they feel despair, we know statistically sort of that they give up, and they're actually less motivated to participate in politics, for example, and other forms of action. And so it's important not to despair, but at the same time, I think we have to use our imaginations and hearken to science.
Right. But I think part of the pleasure of this mermaid book is that it's about the doom and gloom without ever having to dwell on that. It's a bit of a lark, and it's funny. Do you feel yourself moving in and out of satire in your various book projects as a way of managing like your own, I don't want to say your mood, but just like how could you live in that dark dystopic place for 5 years? It seems like you must need to alternate.
I do sort of write serious books part of the time, and then I'll, just to cheer myself up, write a lighter book like this one. Although it's not necessarily that I'm covered in doom and gloom when I'm writing serious books, it's more just that the sort of abstract process is harder. Or so the process of writing more emotional novels, like my trilogy is just sort of more emotional, more sort of raw emotion, but also sort of concerned with interiority and philosophy to some degree. I mean, that sounds too lofty, but ideas, I guess. And so sometimes I just need to make myself laugh. I'm one of those like creepy laughers, who laughs at books in the subway like out loud, and people get uncomfortable. So I have to make myself laugh every now and then, and I find that writing a funny book does that for me, because I'm just one of those creepy laughers.
So
laugh at my own stuff as I'm writing it, and disturb my children sometimes. Yes, I do, because that's just who I am.
That's interesting, because there's Flaubert, who's famously wrote about Madame Bovary, and he had tears coming down his face as he wrote it. And I teach at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I always tell my students, I am not that type. Like, I can be writing funny, but I'm not laughing, because I'm thinking about all these little technical things, and I wish I were.
Well, only occasionally do I laugh. I mean, that's like a really good day for me if I've made myself laugh, But it's usually I'll write stuff, and then when I'm reading it over to myself, I'll go or something. It's not while I'm actually, typing in the words usually. It's on reflection or something.
And your kids call you out on it? They're like, Mom.
If they happen by, they're sort of horrified, and just it's sort of like when I dance or something, they're like, oh, so uncool. It's just uncool.
Right, it's weird. It's totally weird. So you gave an interview a while back to Book Forum where you talked about empathy and how all your books are about empathy. And more recently, there was a great profile of you in the LA Times, and you're quoted, I think, as saying that you found your first couple books, which were funny books, but you said something about them being not as generous to the characters as you wanted, maybe a little snarky. We could talk about your evolution from the snark to the more deeply thought feeling, but I also wanted to suggest that maybe we talk about book reviewing, because that's where snarkiness has been talked about so much. And there's this, for the last, I don't even know how many years, people have been concerned that in US letters, critiquers are not trying to understand where the novel was coming from or what it was trying to do, but just looking for an opportunity to be funny and bitchy. And so I wondered, because you do some book reviews. You recently did Martin Amos's Holocaust book and started with a very funny line, like, I'm paraphrasing, but just like, oh no, not another Holocaust novel. How do you negotiate the snark empathy divide as a writer of reviews and also as somebody who gets reviewed?
Well, as a writer of reviews, when I was younger, when I was in my 20s, I did write a couple of snarky reviews, and I'm very ashamed of them now. Luckily, almost no one has read them. But
Do you want to apologize to anybody personally?
I apologize to all of you for that disrespect. But I just sort of learned better over time because it's so easy. It's just a facile act to write, and it just sort of makes you look smart or something, or you think it makes you look smart, but it's not an honorable way to criticize a book. You should never be glib about someone else's work. But that said, of course, if you don't like a book, you have a certain duty to say so, but just not in a snarky way. So it should be genuine, but not easy, I think, the way you formally relate to a book. And so I've stopped writing snarky reviews anymore. And when I get one, it's very easy for it to just wash over me. It doesn't really bother me. And funny books always get more bad reviews than more earnest books, I've noticed. So I knew when I published this book that it would get a few bad reviews that were just like, oh, this is not funny and it's stupid, I don't like it.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, that funny books get worse reviews. And also I noticed that books that are serious or earnest and lyrical often get the benefit of the doubt that there's a subject there. Yeah. There's a there, whereas if you're writing funny, people tend to think that there's not a subject, which is ludicrous.
I think, there's a sort of, in the way that I actually did a conversation that's coming out, I think, next week in Salon about this various thing, at salon.com, about this various thing, the way that
on the internet.
Serious books are treated versus, allegedly funny books. I think that people feel guiltier, sort of, in the literary establishment, not liking books that seem earnest or books that seem like benevolent gestures, whereas funny books are just read as more sort of morally ambiguous to people because you can't tell exactly how you're supposed to feel. The book's not telling you how to feel at any given moment. It's just offering you a laugh or not to laugh also, if that's what happens. But I think people suspect humor of having ulterior motives or something that straighter books are just sort of not suspected of having. I think that's part of it. I think it's more complicated.
Yeah, no, and I think Deb in the Mermaids book is like that. Is that some readers may come to her and think, oh, she's a gal friend. This is sort of like chick lit. She's going to tell me what it's like to handle her honeymoon. But then, she starts making judgments about characters. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's not. It feels like she's moved into the snark zone. And then it seems like what the story does is sort of pull her out of that, or pull her out of the easy, ironic position where she's shielded from looking at certain things.
Yeah, I think the book gets slightly less funny as it goes along, and that's sort of usually what, not to make you stop reading it or anything, but it becomes more serious and more more questioning about things. I can't just write a book that sort of just stays with the same, or I'm not interested in writing a book that just stays with the same tone all along, because it seems to me that that's what some sort of more superficial funny books do. For example, I used to love P.G. Wodehouse growing up. I read all of P.G. Wodehouse, and I still think P.G. Wodehouse, was very, very funny to me at that time. But now if I read one of those books, there's never any change as you go along. There's never any variation in sort of emotional tone or texture. It never takes a turn in any way at all except plot twists.
Right.
And you come out of it exactly the same as you were when you went in. You come out of reading that book just sort of affirmed in all your opinions. I just sort of, that was funny.
Right.
Now I'm going to go have a snack.
A Pim's cup.
I always hope for my books to last beyond, the act of reading them.
Yeah, no, and I think that's why I was saying it feels like it's a train that jumps the track. It's or it's like a book with a trap door. So
and many of my books do that, I think, right? It's not, they all sort of twist at a certain point. Even the voice sort of distorts at a certain point.
Right,
usually.
which as a reader makes you ask questions. So speaking of questions, we're supposed to open it up to the audience.
Yes,
so that
yes, absolutely, please.
Oh, now we can finally see you, which is nice. Hello. So we have lovely, helpful people with microphones who will run to you if you raise your hand with a question.
And do feel free. We love it when people say things.
We've got one back here.
I gather that you're a writer who has written a lot of novels, and your day job is not teaching creative writing, like
That's
so many
correct.
novelists, like it is for so many novelists.
Ain't she lucky?
I just wanted to hear more about what that's like. It actually sounds, your life sounds pretty enviable in that it sounds like you get meaning from a job that has nothing to do with writing. And I always wonder about all these writers who are kind of forced to teach undergraduates or graduate students writing, and maybe they don't want to do that, but that's what they have to do. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I have. I've taught a couple of times, just, one class or one semester. I was at Columbia. But generally, well, first of all, I don't think I'm a very good reader of bad fiction, which makes me a poor teacher. I think it's not for me. And I also feel like it just gets on me when I read it. Like it just, so mean. I love interacting with students and stuff. I'm just not very good at reading their work. I'm so glad that I, as an undergraduate, had teachers who weren't like that at all and who were lovely. But also I love the work that I do. It actually does have to do, I'm like a staff writer there, an editor, and so I edit almost all our press materials and just our public materials that go out. So I am using certain related skills, but I do love that work, and I couldn't give it up. I guess unless they were to fire me, then I would have to give it up. But I love it, and I love feeling, I've always been the kind of writer who just loves writing more than anything, writing my own work. I just love it, it makes me happy. It's not a source of torture or torment for me. I have some friends who are brilliant writers, but for whom the act of writing is sort of tortuous, and I'm just not that stripe of writer. And so I always end up just feeling self-indulgent if that's all I do. And so it makes me feel useful, however illusory that feeling is, to have this other job that I believe in and I'm passionate about. I feel very lucky to have it. I really do feel lucky to have it. And also I get to work with people who are astonishingly effective at doing things that I'm deeply moved by. So yeah, it's a fortunate position indeed. I could do with just a few fewer hours a week, I was just saying to Sarah, to work on my own work. But other than that, I'm very happy.
I know this question is asked of authors a lot, but I would like to hear about your day in terms of how you devote your time to writing and your process and your space, and how you prepare yourself to sit down and start to write.
I was just writing a little brief thing for a trade publication, Publishers Weekly. They asked me to write tips for writing. And in that I said that like my process feels to me more like purse snatching than anything else these days. That's how it's just this furtive act of grabbing little blocks of time to do my own books. And it's hard because you have to get back into them every time you go away from the text. When you come back, you have to sort of re-immerse yourself, and that takes time. And so it's very inefficient, my process right now. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. I have this other write-up of tips on writing that I did for a website called The Millions that will be out in a couple of weeks, which really is more, I guess it's more of a satirical piece that I did. But essentially, I think the more privileged you are, the easier it is to be a writer. So I recommend independent wealth. Get rid of the children. They're very counterproductive. Pets are allowed if they're silent and unmoving. I think that I think the biggest thing is if you're interested in writing. I don't know if that's the perspective from which you ask, but I think the best thing is to read a lot of books and sort of love them, and then when you turn away from reading, write what you want to read. Write what you haven't found to read yet. That's the way I write books. I just sort of sit down and see what happens, if I can make a story that I'd like to read myself. And I don't have any real forethought that goes into books anymore. I mean, I used to sort of, when I was young, plan things out a bit, and I don't do that anymore. So I just sit down and look at a blank screen and then decide what to write. I don't even decide, actually. It's more like just automatic writing or something. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not trying to cast it in some sort of romantic or light exactly. It's just that it's more fun for me. There's more joy in it if I don't sketch it out ahead of time. And then for me, it's all about the first page and the first sort of the voice that you make on the first page, and then the rest of the book comes from that. And I always have a title before I start as well, because I don't know. It's good to have something to hang it on. Anyway, I don't know if that's totally useless for you.
Other questions?
How much of you is in your characters?
You know, I don't write a literal sort of autobiography at all, really. I've never been a person who writes directly about my own life much. But I think voice-wise and personality-wise, I think I'm in, you know, lots of me is in there. You know, parts of me are in Deb. There's this one character who I've always felt close to in a book called Ghost Lights, which is in this trilogy that Sara referred to, How the Dead Dream, Ghost Lights, and Magnificence. And there's this guy who works for the IRS, is the main character of Ghost Lights. Hal, his name is. And I've always felt like Hal had a lot of me in him, actually. He's this very passive IRS, like career IRS, you know, bureaucrat. And I really relate to Hal, actually. But there's always a lot of me in the voice, and just not in the details, you know, not in the life details. But yeah, there's always the language, I think, is, although my books do vary, I think, a fair amount. Like it's not like I write one book and then a different iteration of it. They're quite different from each other, which makes me hard to brand if you're my publisher. But there is usually a certain recognizable quality to the voice. So I just say mostly in voice is how I show up.
Who are some of the writers you love, or who influenced you when you were starting to write? Or who are the writers who you particularly admire at the moment?
There are a lot. I do write. I read pretty sort of all over the place. A lot of European writers. I love many of them deceased. Thomas Bernhardt, an Austrian writer, is a great inspiration to me. He was very funny and did, you know, long run-on sentences that went on for pages, but very, very funny and sort of self-loathing. I admire self-loathing writers often. I remember loving like Confederacy of Dunces, for example, when I was young, like I don't know, 21 or 22. I loved that book. I love Virginia Woolf, actually. Didn't you mention her? Of course, I love Virginia Woolf. I loved Beckett, Elias Canetti. Karl Čapek wrote this great book called War with the Newts. It was like a seminal sci-fi thing about large talking newts that take over the world. Right? You know it well. No, it's a great story. It's very fun. But I read constantly contemporary American fiction to know what's happening. I mean, I really do try to read all the time in sort of my own culture and stuff, and to just sort of know what's happening out there. So I'm always reading. I've just been reading poetry this week, some good poets. This woman, Mary Ruffel, who's wonderful. And she does great prose, too, actually. Yeah, anyway, I'll stop talking now.
We have time for one more question.
How do you read all these books? Do you read them in a hardcover or softcover, or do you read them on a Kindle, or?
Sometimes I even listen to audiobooks while I'm... It's terrible. No, I read in all formats. I do like old-fashioned books. That's my favorite, for sure. But I will, in a pinch, I read on a device. Yeah, whatever. I'll read. When I'm traveling, I always, except this week, my son stole my iPad before I could leave, before I could take it with me. But yeah, I'll read however I can. And I do like reading books digitally. I don't like reading online very much, like long things online. I get restless, but I do like ebooks and stuff fine. I have time to read, even though I don't have time to write sometimes, because there are times when you can read when you can't write. Like, obviously, you have to have sort of more dedicated attention for writing, and reading can happen any old time. Sometimes I'm the person on the exercise machine with the book. Very often, actually, if I'm on the exercise machine at all.
Laughing. You're the one laughing
Yes, I'm
weirdly
laughing weirdly.
on the So, in favor of reading, out in the lobby, there are copies of Mermaids in Paradise and Magnificence and How the Dead Dream, which is 2 of the 3 books in the trilogy, not the one featuring you, aka Hal. But we could get you started on the trilogy, and Lydia will be signing, I believe, right?
Yes, I'm happy to sign if you're happy to buy.
Yeah, so meet us out in the lobby. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much.